wind had begun its slow, mournful sweep across the manicured lawns of Ashford Manor, rattling the tall windows and setting the trees into restless motion. Within the grand drawing-room, an air of unease clung like a shadow. Candles flickered, casting elongated shapes across the ornate Persian rugs, and the faint smell of wood smoke mingled with something else, something faintly metallic. Sir Cedric Ashford, the patriarch of the family, had been found dead in his study just past midnight, and the circumstances surrounding his death had confounded everyone. The police were already on edge, pacing and whispering, yet even their sharpest minds could find no satisfactory explanation. The study was locked from the inside, the key resting on the writing desk where Sir Cedric had been found, his lifeless hand still clutching a pen. The crime scene was deceptively simple. Sir Cedric lay slumped over his mahogany desk, a single letter opener protruding from his chest. His face bore a look of frozen shock, his eyes wide and unseeing. Nothing in the room had been disturbed. Books were aligned neatly on their shelves, the curtains hung undisturbed, and the windows were locked. On the surface, it seemed to be a classic case of murder in a locked room, yet there was something subtly, unnervingly off. A small black chess pawn rested atop the blotter. It was the only item out of place, and yet no one could understand its meaning. There were no footprints beyond Sir Cedric's, no sign of forced entry, and the Manor's dogs, known for their keen senses, had not even barked. The household had been roused by the maids, who insisted they heard nothing unusual. Lady Ashford, seated in the parlour with her hands trembling, had been the one to first discover the body. "I went to check on Cedric," she explained between sobs, "and the door was locked. I knocked and called, but there was no answer. Then I saw this." She gestured vaguely toward the study. The police had already noted the improbability of the scenario. A murder had taken place, but there was no weapon lying around besides the letter opener. No other prints, no traces of poison, no signs of struggle. It was as if the death had arrived silently, like a shadow stealing over the room, leaving nothing behind but a single pawn on a polished desk. By morning, the local constable had called in Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet reputation for keen observation and an almost uncanny understanding of human nature had reached the furthest corners of the county. Miss Marple arrived at Ashford Manor in the soft light of dawn, her eyes immediately assessing the manor's structure, the positions of doors and windows, the angles of the study's furnishings. She walked slowly through the drawing-room, nodding politely to the anxious servants, before making her way to the scene of the crime. The first thing Miss Marple noticed was the incongruity of the chess pawn. It was small, black, polished to a reflective sheen, and yet completely out of place among the orderly chaos of Sir Cedric's study. Placing her gloved hand gently near it, she did not touch but considered it from all angles. "A pawn," she murmured under her breath. But why leave such a thing? Was it a message or merely a distraction? She glanced at the letter opener, noting its peculiar position. The angle of entry was precise, almost clinical. It suggested either someone with considerable skill or a scenario designed to make the crime appear solvable while concealing its true nature. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the locks and the key. The door had been secured from the inside, and there was no sign of tampering. Windows, too, remained locked and barred. It was a baffling setup, the sort that often tempted one into overcomplicating the solution. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Rarely was the simplest answer obscured beneath a veil of theatricality, anything less than revealing. She crouched near the hearth, her eyes catching the faint trace of scuff marks on the rug, barely perceptible unless one knew where to look. They were irregular, but they suggested that the rug had been moved or handled, perhaps to hide something beneath it. She made a mental note to investigate further. Next, she examined Sir Cedric's personal effects. A ledger sat open to a page filled with neat entries, nothing unusual except for a single annotation in the margin. Pawn 1245. It seemed innocuous, yet in Miss Marple's experience no detail was ever truly meaningless. Was it a time, a code, or merely a coincidence, a mark left by Sir Cedric himself before his death? She could not yet tell. The family members, gathered nervously nearby, watched her with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Lady Ashford wrung her hands, whispering that she could not imagine who would harm her husband. But who, indeed, Miss Marple thought. and yet she sensed undercurrents in the household, quiet rivalries, small grievances, subtle resentments that often simmered unnoticed until an event like this brought them to light. Miss Marple's attention then shifted to the smaller details of the room. A faint odour lingered, metallic yet faintly sweet, almost imperceptible unless one paused to notice. It came from the inkwell, but the ink itself seemed untouched. She looked closer and discovered a tiny fleck of a powdery substance on the edge of the desk, so small it could have been dismissed by any less meticulous investigator. Carefully, she took note. The placement suggested intention, not accident. Someone had left it there deliberately, though what it was meant to communicate remained unclear. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had spoken quietly with each member of the household, gathering observations with an almost imperceptible skill. The gardener claimed to have seen Sir Cedric in his study at the usual hour, working on estate accounts, while the butler insisted all doors were secured after the last meal. Each statement, while seemingly trivial, allowed Miss Marple to construct a web of possible movements, intentions, and opportunities. No one was missing. No one had left the manor. Yet still, the puzzle remained. A man dead in a locked room, a lone pawn, a ledger annotation, a hint of powder, and a room that spoke only of order and meticulous care. Miss Marple finally allowed herself a small smile, barely noticeable. It was the kind of crime that appeared too simple, too neat, almost intentionally designed to mislead. Yet those were always the most rewarding. She knew that the answer would lie not in the grand theatrics, but in the subtleties, the misplaced item, the hint of resentment, the tiny clue that everyone else overlooked. The pawn, she realized, was not merely a chess piece, but a message, a signature perhaps, left by someone who wished to tease, mislead, or draw attention. Hours passed as she examined the study from every conceivable angle, retracing movements and reassessing the minutiae. She noted the alignment of the furniture, the patterns of light at different times of night, and the subtle odours lingering in the room. Every detail, she reflected, was part of a larger tapestry. In time, the impossible would begin to make sense. The locked room, the pristine desk, the solitary pawn. They were all components of a story, deliberately obscured, awaiting the right mind to interpret them. As the sun rose higher, casting long beams of light across Ashford Manor, Miss Marple stood silently in the study. She did not speak, yet the tension in the room shifted, a quiet acknowledgement that her mind was working, unravelling what others could not. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, a sense of anticipation began to gather. The crime was baffling, yes, but not unsolvable. The key was in the details, the misdirections, the subtle gestures, and most importantly, the human element. Sir Cedric's death was no ordinary misfortune. It was a puzzle, one deliberately crafted, one that would reveal its secrets only to the patient and the observant. And Miss Marple, as always, was both. Miss Marple had barely settled into the study when the first constable, a young man named Harding, began to fidget nervously, shuffling papers and muttering about evidence logs. He moved with the mechanical precision of someone trained to follow rules, yet blind to the nuances of human behaviour that often told a truer story than any fingerprint or footprint. "We'll need to catalogue everything, Miss Marple," he said, pointing at the desk as if it were a sacred altar of proof. "Every item must be accounted for, photographed and sealed." "Of course," she replied, her voice soft, unassuming, but carrying the weight of certainty that made Harding hesitate. While he fussed with his camera and notebook, she allowed her gaze to drift once more over the study, letting her attention linger on corners and edges that others deemed unremarkable. The room was immaculate, almost unnaturally so, yet perfection itself often concealed truths. Her eyes fell upon the fireplace, polished and empty save for a few smouldering embers. It was customary for Sir Cedric to keep a small basket of kindling by the hearth, yet none was present. Miss Marple noted the faint scratch along the marble hearth's edge, subtle but deliberate, as if something had been slid across it. Small, nearly invisible marks, but in her experience every mark spoke. She crouched closer, examining the pattern. There had been movement here. A small object, perhaps heavy enough to leave a trace, had been placed and removed with care. Her mind catalogued it as a minor puzzle piece, the significance of which might only emerge later. While she considered the hearth, Harding interrupted again, showing her a set of prints discovered on the window-sill. "We think they're from Sir Cedric, naturally," he said, "but they might belong to—" He glanced nervously at the staff gathered in the doorway. "Anyone." He stopped short, clearly unsettled by his own suggestion. Miss Marple took the offered gloves, handling them gingerly. The prints were faint, the outlines smudged in a way that suggested haste or deliberate misdirection. "Yes," she murmured. "These are consistent with someone trying to appear careless while concealing an intention. A simple smudge can speak more loudly than a clean print if one knows how to read it." Her attention then shifted to Lady Ashford, who hovered near the doorway, hands clasped tightly, eyes darting between her husband's study and the detective. There was a tension in her posture, a subtle stiffness in her shoulders that spoke of controlled emotion rather than natural grief. Miss Marple made a quiet mental note. She had long observed that in a household of long familiarity, true feelings were never entirely hidden, even by those who believed themselves capable of absolute concealment. A twitch in an eyelid, a shift of weight, a hesitation before speech, all were breadcrumbs for those patient enough to follow. As she rose to examine the desk more closely, her eyes were drawn to a small, unassuming object near the ledger, the inkwell. At first glance it appeared ordinary, but a faint residue around the edge caught her attention. She leaned forward, her breath shallow as she examined it in the morning light. A powdery trace, almost imperceptible, hinted at substances unusual in the context of writing implements. Perhaps powdered chalk, or a finely ground salt. Her experience suggested it was neither accidental nor naturally occurring in that location. Someone had handled the desk with intent, leaving this subtle mark as either a signal or a misdirection. The chess pawn, still sitting atop the blotter, continued to intrigue her. It was not the kind of object one left behind absent-mindedly. Its presence was too deliberate, too conspicuous to be accidental. She reached for it, careful not to disturb other items, and turned it over in her fingers. There was no inscription, no hidden compartment, yet the pawn felt oddly weighted, not in terms of size, but in purpose. Miss Marple had seen such things before, objects meant to communicate in silence, their meaning only revealed to those who knew what to look for. Her musings were interrupted by the butler, who had been silently observing her. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone deferential yet tight with anxiety, "there is something you might wish to see in the conservatory. Sir Cedric often retreated there before dinner." Curiosity piqued, she followed him through the winding corridors of the manor. The conservatory was a bright glassed room filled with tropical plants and delicate flowers. Yet there, among the verdant leaves and glossy ferns, lay a small, folded note. It had not been noticed before, tucked into the crook of a potted fern. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably Sir Cedric's, though the message was cryptic. "The first move decides all. Watch the pawn, for the path is never as it seems." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. This note did not clarify. It complicated. But in her mind, complication was never a hindrance. It was a doorway. Returning to the study, she considered the household once more. The maid who had discovered the body seemed to tremble more than natural fear could explain. When pressed for details, she stumbled over times and sequences, contradicting herself in subtle ways. A casual observer might have dismissed this as nervousness, yet Miss Marple recognized the signs of concealment. The contradictions were minor, but they mattered. A slip in chronology often revealed what intent could not. Meanwhile, Harding and his fellow officers busied themselves cataloguing every object, every book, every trivial detail. They worked with diligence but lacked the instinct for significance that Miss Marple possessed. While they photographed each item, she noticed the small subtleties that eluded them. A chair slightly misaligned with the desk, the faint impression of something dragged across the carpet, the angled light suggesting an alternative viewpoint from which the room's layout would appear different. Each detail, seemingly mundane, contributed to the larger picture she was beginning to assemble in her mind. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged herself back in the drawing-room, quietly sipping tea while her eyes never left the study. The house was silent now, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft sigh of wind against the windows. She allowed herself a moment to reflect, connecting the threads, The chess pawn, the cryptic note, the powder residue, the faint scuff marks, and the subtle inconsistencies in the household's account. Each on its own was insignificant, but together they formed a tapestry, one that whispered of deception, careful planning, and a mind that understood how to manipulate appearances. Miss Marple rose, moving with deliberate slowness, and returned to the study once more. Her eyes swept over the desk, the blotter, the ledger, and finally the chess pawn. She felt the thrill that came with the first signs of clarity in a baffling mystery. The pieces were aligning, though the full picture remained obscured. Somewhere in the quiet manipulation of the household, in the subtle adjustments of items and timing, lay the explanation. She did not yet know how it would reveal itself, but Miss Marple trusted the pattern. It always did. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the tall windows, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The crime, simple on the surface yet artful in its concealment, had begun to speak, and she, with patience honed over years of quiet observation, was listening intently. In the coming hours, she knew, the first threads of truth would unravel, guided by the keen eye and the unassuming mind that had never been wrong in the pursuit of human cunning. Miss Marple began her inquiries with a quiet, unassuming patience that belied her sharp perception. She chose to speak first with Lady Ashford, who still lingered near the drawing-room windows, wringing her hands and glancing repeatedly toward the study. Lady Ashford's grief was apparent, yet Miss Marple noticed subtle tensions in her posture, the slight stiffening of her back, the way her hands flexed in anticipation rather than true sorrow. "Lady Ashford," Miss Marple began softly, "you mentioned that you discovered your husband shortly after midnight. Can you recall anything you noticed before entering the study? Anything unusual, no matter how small?" The lady hesitated, biting her lip. I heard nothing at first. The house was so quiet, but yes, I thought I heard a soft rustling, like the turning of a page. I assumed it was Sir Cedric, reading late as usual. Her eyes darted toward the study, lingering on the desk where the letter opener still protruded. But now I think I may have heard footsteps, just one set, but they were so faint I cannot be certain. Miss Marple inclined her head, making a mental note of the contradiction. She understood instinctively that Lady Ashford's memory, influenced by grief and shock, might blur the line between certainty and supposition, yet even uncertainty could carry meaning if measured against other accounts. Next, she approached the butler, a man named Havisham, who stood rigid near the mantel, his hands clasped tightly behind him. "Mr. Havisham, you were the last to see Sir Cedric alive, were you not?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, encouraging trust rather than defensiveness. "Yes, miss," he replied, his tone clipped. "He retired to the study after dinner. I ensured that all doors were secured. The house was quiet. Everyone went to bed at their usual times. I retired to my quarters shortly thereafter." "And you noticed nothing unusual during that time?" she pressed gently. Havisham's eyes flickered briefly, a small, involuntary tell, and he adjusted his stance. "Nothing that I would consider unusual. Everything was as it should be." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. It was a careful choice of words. As it should be. To those skilled in observing human nuance, the phrase suggested expectation rather than experience. Havisham believed he had maintained order, yet something in his tone hinted at awareness he was unwilling to articulate. She filed this observation away, a thread to be examined later. The gardener, a grizzled man named Collins, offered a different perspective. Called upon to account for the night's events, he appeared bemused by the attention. "I was in the grounds, of course," he said. "I saw nothing, heard nothing save for the wind in the trees. But I thought I glimpsed a shadow at one of the windows around midnight. I can't be sure. It moved too fast, and the moonlight played tricks." Miss Marple noted the hesitation and the vagueness. "Did you recognize the shape of this shadow?" He shook his head. "Number Y?" I did not linger. Figured it was nothing. Each account, when viewed individually, was plausible. Together they formed a lattice of uncertainty, each statement intersecting with another at contradictory angles. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that these accounts were slowly unspooling the truth. The maid, Clara, who had discovered the body, was next. Her hands trembled as she recounted the morning's events. I was fetching water for Sir Cedric, and when I approached the study, the door was locked. I called out, but he did not answer. I found the key on the desk and opened it. Her words rushed, spilling over each other in her anxiety. Miss Marple observed carefully. Clara's eagerness, her rapid speech suggested a desire to appear helpful, almost to preempt questioning. Yet the inconsistencies in her account, the exact timing of finding the door locked, the discovery of the key, hinted at either confusion or deliberate misrepresentation. She made a quiet note to cross-reference her statements with the others. As she interviewed each member of the household, patterns of omission began to emerge. Some were overly precise, detailing mundane routines with robotic accuracy. Others were vague, hesitant, or careful to skirt certain subjects. Miss Marple recognized the tension that underpinned these variations, the desire to protect, to conceal, or to manipulate perception. She then addressed the family's distant cousin, Arthur Pembroke, who had been visiting Ashford Manor for the weekend. He was restless, shifting from foot to foot, offering explanations that were almost too eager. "I saw Sir Cedric just after dinner," he claimed. "He mentioned needing to review some accounts. I didn't hear or see anything else. I assumed he would be safe in his study. Yes, quite certain of it." Yet Miss Marple's keen observation noted his eyes flicking toward the ledger, the chess pawn, and then away, as though he feared acknowledgement. "You are certain of the time you last saw him?" she asked softly. Arthur hesitated. "Well, perhaps it was after dinner, yes. Or shortly before. He faltered, as though attempting to reshape his memory under subtle pressure. That single pause, the minor fracture in his narrative, was enough to flag him in Miss Marple's mind. People rarely fumbled their own story unless there was reason to hide or misdirect. Even the household pets offered clues. The dogs, normally alert and vocal, had been silent through the night. Miss Marple considered this anomaly carefully. Animals, sensitive to the slightest irregularity, could provide insight into the timing and nature of human movements. The silence, she noted, suggested a disturbance so subtle that even the dogs were uncertain how to react, or so deliberate that it lulled them into inaction. As the hours passed, Miss Marple began assembling the puzzle. Each account contributed a piece of the larger image: the maid's anxious eagerness, the butler's clipped precision, the gardener's vague shadow, Arthur's faltering certainty, Lady Ashford's hesitations. Beneath these words lay unspoken motives, concealed emotions, and the invisible currents of household dynamics. She could see the faint glimmer of human desires, fear, loyalty, envy, ambition, threading through the otherwise mundane routines of Ashford Manor. Then she recalled the note from the conservatory. "The first move decides all. Watch the pawn, for the path is never as it seems." Its cryptic warning now resonated in the context of these narratives. Perhaps the pawn, the subtle residue on the desk, and the minor discrepancies in the accounts were all interwoven, signals sent and received, deliberately arranged to conceal truth while revealing intent to those capable of interpretation. Miss Marple paused, allowing herself a slow breath. The voices of the household, though seemingly contradictory, were beginning to form a pattern. Some statements contained half-truths, others a careful avoidance of the full reality. It was not merely a question of who had opportunity or access, but why each person chose to present the fragments of truth they did. Understanding that would be crucial in identifying the orchestrator of the deception. By evening she had returned once more to the study, examining the scuff marks, the chess pawn, and the ledger in meticulous detail. She replayed each conversation in her mind, noting every inflection, hesitation, and insistence. It became evident that the crime was layered, a careful act of violence overlaid with subtle manipulation of perception, a choreography in which every household member, knowingly or unknowingly, played a role. The first whispers of understanding began to surface. There was a presence behind. The words, a deliberate effort to shape belief, and in each account, Miss Marple sensed an invisible hand nudging the narrative, guiding attention away from the critical detail. Yet her patience, honed over years of quiet observation, allowed her to see through the artifice. The truth she knew was present in these contradictions. It merely awaited the careful unweaving of intent from expression. As night settled over Ashford Manor, Miss Marple sat by the study's window, gazing at the darkening grounds. She reflected upon the day's revelations. Every witness, every statement had offered a clue. Not a direct answer, but a hint, a subtle misdirection, a shadow of motive. The voices of deception were beginning to harmonize into an intelligible pattern, one that would guide her toward the hidden truths of Sir Cedric's final hours. Somewhere within these intertwined accounts lay the key, and Miss Marple was certain she was now close enough to perceive it. Miss Marple spent the next morning in quiet contemplation, her sharp eyes following the familiar lines of the manor with renewed focus. The house seemed to breathe differently now, the tension from the previous day still lingering in the corners and corridors. She began to examine the human elements with the same meticulous care she had devoted to the physical clues, understanding that motive, far more than opportunity alone, often illuminated the path toward truth. Sir Cedric had been a man of stature and influence, his wealth substantial and well known. The manor itself, though stately, was less an abode than a carefully cultivated emblem of his legacy. To the casual observer, everyone in the household moved in predictable patterns, yet Miss Marple sensed the subtle strains of ambition, resentment, and greed beneath the surface. Each member, when examined closely, offered a potential thread in the tapestry of motive. She returned first to Lady Ashford, whose mourning, though outwardly composed, seemed to ripple with concealed emotion. Alone, Miss Marple allowed her observations to settle. The lady had married Sir Cedric decades ago, and yet there had been whispers over the years of dissatisfaction and latent resentment. Was it ambition, the quiet desire to influence the estate or to redirect its wealth, or was her grief genuine, mingled with fear and confusion, rather than any darker intent? Miss Marple could not discount her as a mere grieving widow without motive. The absence of opportunity would be meaningless in a household where appearances mattered most. The butler, Havisham, was next under her subtle scrutiny. Years of service had allowed him unparalleled access, and yet his stoicism often concealed more than it revealed. Miss Marple considered the nature of loyalty. Was Havisham genuinely devoted to Sir Cedric, or had a sense of self-interest grown over time? Perhaps there was resentment in small injustices, the quiet anger of someone aware that they did not possess the wealth or recognition they deserved. A financial motive, or even a desire to manipulate the household for subtle gain, could not be ignored. Collins, the gardener, was less overtly entwined in the daily machinations of the manor, but Miss Marple remembered the shadows he claimed to have glimpsed on the night of the death. Was it simply a trick of light, or had he seen something he did not yet reveal? The simplest explanations often masked complexity, and yet Collins's position allowed him movement across the grounds without suspicion. A man like him, slighted or overlooked, could act in ways few would anticipate. Perhaps anger, perhaps jealousy, perhaps a minor grudge built over years of unnoticed effort could have driven him to a sudden, desperate act. Arthur Pembroke presented a more obvious, though still tangled line of potential motive. A visiting relative, he had been openly ambitious, often too eager to impress, too conscious of his place in the household hierarchy. Miss Marple noted how his eyes lingered on certain possessions, the ledger, the chess pawn, the ledger's annotations. There was an unmistakable undercurrent of calculation, an awareness of opportunity that bordered on entitlement. Did he covet the estate, or did he seek simply to unsettle the family? Either possibility carried weight, and his faltering recollection the previous day hinted at thoughts he might have tried to suppress or redirect. She reviewed the interactions between the household members as well. Small tensions, subtle rivalries, and unspoken disputes formed a lattice of hidden motives. Lady Ashford's occasional disdain for Arthur's forwardness, Havisham's silent watchfulness over Lady Ashford, Collins's quiet suspicion of outsiders, all intersected and intertwined. Each reaction and counter-reaction carried the potential to reveal more than any single confession. The web was complicated. Disentangling it required patience, a mind attuned to nuance, and an appreciation for human fallibility. Miss Marple turned her thoughts again to the peculiar chess pawn. Its symbolic weight had not escaped her. In the game of chess, The pawn was the smallest piece, seemingly insignificant, yet capable of influencing outcomes far beyond its apparent importance. Could the pawn represent a warning, a signature, a psychological nudge aimed at someone within the household? Whoever had left it was communicating with intent, layering meaning upon the already complex lattice of motives. She considered who among them had the insight or inclination to use such subtlety, and the answer seemed to point toward a mind both clever and deliberate. As she began mapping the relationships and potential grievances, a clearer picture of intertwined motives began to emerge. Lady Ashford's potential for ambition, Arthur's desire to assert influence, Havisham's subtle resentment, and even Collins's quiet animosities created multiple overlapping pathways toward the crime. Each could act for self-interest, or in response to perceived slights. The problem was that no single theory accounted for every detail. The puzzle required reconciling intent with opportunity, personal desire with circumstance, and subtle signals with overt action. Miss Marple began methodically testing the alibis. Lady Ashford claimed to have been in her chambers for much of the evening, interrupted only briefly by a servant. Yet her account relied heavily on memory and perception of time, easily skewed under stress. Havisham maintained he retired early, his careful timing leaving gaps that could accommodate subtle activity. Collins's movements in the gardens, while outwardly innocuous, could have permitted quiet approaches to the manor unnoticed. Arthur's account, already fragile in its internal consistency, left room for error or manipulation, intentional or otherwise. Each alibi, while superficially plausible, contained subtle openings for action. In addition to opportunity, Miss Marple considered the psychological aspect. Jealousy, ambition, greed and fear often guided human behaviour as strongly as logic or circumstance. She recalled how Lady Ashford had regarded the ledger with a mixture of concern and detachment, how Arthur's gaze had lingered on the chess pawn, how Havisham had flinched slightly when questioned about the housekeeping routine. Even Collins had exhibited a faint, almost imperceptible thrill when recounting his fleeting shadow on the windowsill. The clues were human, intangible, but no less revealing. Miss Marple also noted the subtle alliances forming under the surface. Lady Ashford and Havisham shared unspoken glances, a silent communication that could suggest collaboration or protection. Arthur, eager to assert his significance, seemed unaware or perhaps dismissive of these dynamics, yet his actions could inadvertently align with them. Even Collins, who appeared detached, might serve as a pawn in a larger psychological game, acting without full awareness of the forces at work. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had begun arranging these motives visually, sketching a web of interconnections and potential influences. Each suspect's motive radiated outward, intersecting at critical points: the ledger, the study, the conservatory, the chess pawn. Some intersections were obvious: disputes over inheritance, resentment over privilege, envy of opportunity. Others were subtler, shaped by human instinct and the desire to protect or manipulate perception. She noted how small misdirections, seemingly innocuous statements and carefully staged actions all contributed to the obfuscation of true intent. And yet, even as the web grew more complex, Miss Marple sensed an underlying order. The chaos of potential motives, while vast, followed human patterns, predictable desires, fears and strategies. She did not rush to conclusions, but she allowed herself to consider which threads were likely genuine and which were decoys. Her mind weighed. Greed against ambition, resentment against opportunity, fear against boldness. In her experience, motive alone did not reveal the culprit, but it framed the possibilities and guided the careful observation of actions and consequences. By evening, as twilight settled over Ashford Manor, Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, contemplating the tangled lattice of human desire she had catalogued. She understood that the truth was not yet fully visible, yet she could see the outlines forming in the interplay of opportunity, subtle tension, and hidden agendas. The next steps would require patience, observation, and a careful alignment of human behaviour with the physical clues she had already gathered. In the hush of the manor, as shadows deepened and the wind whispered through the trees, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, private satisfaction. She had begun to navigate the maze of motives, unravelling the threads of jealousy, greed, ambition, and fear that wove through the household. Each suspect had a reason to act, each statement carried the possibility of deception, and each subtle gesture suggested hidden intent. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly taking shape, and with time, clarity would emerge from the web of lies and half-truths. The first layer of human complexity was laid bare, and Miss Marple's mind, ever patient, began to trace the connections that would eventually reveal not just who had acted, but why. Somewhere within this intricate lattice of motives, she knew, the answer awaited, and she would find it, as she always did, in the quiet, deliberate observation of human nature. By the following morning, the manor seemed to pulse with an air of tentative resolution. The local constables had gathered what they believed to be the defining clue, a small silver locket, discovered beneath the carpet in the study. Its chain was twisted, and inside it contained a miniature portrait of Arthur Pembroke. The police quickly seized upon it as a revelation, convinced that the visiting cousin had acted out of jealousy or ambition. Sir Cedric's death, they proclaimed, was a crime of opportunity fueled by familial desire. The manor buzzed with murmurs of shock and speculation, and even Lady Ashford seemed momentarily reassured, clinging to the idea that the perpetrator had been identified. The officers, bolstered by this apparent breakthrough, moved swiftly. Harding and his colleagues interrogated Arthur with renewed confidence, their questions sharp and insistent. Arthur, initially taken aback, faltered as the locket was placed on the table before him. I don't know how that got there," he stammered, his face pale, eyes wide. "I swear, I have never—" "Your presence in the house gives you motive," Harding said, voice rising with triumph. "You coveted your cousin's inheritance, did you not? You had access, opportunity, and now we have proof linking you directly to the scene." Arthur's protestations were sincere, yet his initial eagerness to assert himself earlier in the investigation now cast him in a suspicious light. To the untrained eye, the case appeared solved. The officers celebrated a neat conclusion, their satisfaction palpable. They even began drafting reports to present to the magistrate, confident that justice had been served. Miss Marple, however, observed the proceedings with quiet unease. She had handled countless cases where apparent evidence led to premature conclusions, and her instincts were alert to the subtleties that suggested this was one such instance. The locket, though compelling on the surface, did not align perfectly with the facts she had gathered. Its discovery seemed almost too convenient, as if it had been placed deliberately to mislead. Her mind traced the sequence of events, from the note in the conservatory to the subtle traces of powder on the desk, the chess pawn, and the minor inconsistencies in witness accounts. Something about the locket's appearance unsettled her. It fit too neatly into a narrative that the real perpetrator would have no reason to want exposed. She approached Arthur quietly, while the constables busied themselves with formalities. "Mr. Pembroke," she said softly, "do you know if this locket has ever been in your possession?" Arthur shook his head, a mixture of relief and frustration washing over him. "Never, Miss Marple. I cannot explain how it came to be there. I did not place it, nor touch it before the discovery." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the young man. "Then it seems we have stumbled upon a very deliberate misdirection." Her words were quiet, almost reflective, but they carried a weight of certainty. She had learned long ago that criminals often use the assumptions and eagerness of others against them, creating false trails while remaining comfortably hidden. Harding, seeing Miss Marple pause, frowned. "You don't accept the evidence?" he asked, incredulous. "I accept what is before me," she replied calmly, "but I do not accept conclusions based solely on convenience or coincidence. Something in this locket's appearance strikes me as staged, perhaps by someone skilled at guiding attention." While the constables debated, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the study. She examined the location where the locket had been found. Its placement beneath the rug, partially hidden, suggested care in positioning, but also a desire for it to be discovered eventually. The folds of the rug showed faint impressions, inconsistent with the way it had been handled in previous examinations. She crouched, following the faint scuff marks with her gloved fingers, realizing that the locket's path had been orchestrated, leading the authorities precisely where its planter wished. Her gaze then fell upon the ledger, still open on the desk. The annotation, Pawn 1245, now seemed even more pointed. The note in the conservatory, the chess pawn on the blotter, the subtle residue of powder on the inkwell. All of these details had been left as breadcrumbs, part of a larger design. Miss Marple understood that the perpetrator thrived on misdirection, creating a false sense of closure while remaining safely in the shadows, observing the chaos they had sown. She considered the human element once more. Lady Ashford's initial relief at the apparent breakthrough, Havisham's barely concealed satisfaction at the neat resolution, Collins's bemused observations, and even Arthur's nervous deflection, all were elements that could be manipulated by someone who understood how to shape perception. The real criminal, she realized, was aware of the eagerness of others to reach a tidy solution. By planting the locket, they had invited suspicion, encouraged overconfidence, and bought themselves time. Miss Marple's mind traced the sequence of human movement, from the subtle interactions between household members to the timing of events in the study. She imagined the placement of the locket, the shadows of observers, the way small gestures had been manipulated to produce a desired effect. Every instinct, honed over decades of observation, screamed that the apparent solution was a trap, an early declaration of victory meant to distract, confuse, and obscure the truth. She returned to the chess pawn, turning it over in her hand once more. Its presence was no mere coincidence. It was a signal, part of the same psychological choreography that had placed the locket. The perpetrator had engineered a game within a game, leaving hints designed to mislead the unwary while guiding the perceptive observer toward a deeper understanding. The pawn symbolized a beginning, a first move in a sequence that had yet to play out. The move had been made, but the final strategy remained hidden. Miss Marple rose from her crouch and observed the household members quietly. Lady Ashford lingered by the window, her expression carefully neutral. Havisham hovered near the mantel, proud of the perceived resolution. Collins leaned against the wall, offering casual commentary to anyone who would listen. Arthur sat stiffly in the corner, relieved yet unsettled. Each played their part in the ongoing drama, unaware that the real orchestrator had already anticipated their reactions. Even the dogs, once alert and sensitive to disturbance, now rested comfortably, their silence a quiet testament to the orchestrator's subtlety. Miss Marple noted this with interest. The absence of reaction was as telling as any bark or growl. The night had been observed, analysed, and manipulated with precision. Whoever had killed Sir Cedric had ensured that every action, every movement, and every assumption fell into place exactly as intended. By late afternoon, the constables, satisfied with their apparent success, prepared to formally close the case. Miss Marple allowed them to proceed for a time, watching the careful choreography of assumption and overconfidence. She sipped her tea slowly, her mind piecing together threads that the officers had overlooked, ignoring the false clarity that had enthralled them. Finally, she moved to the centre of the room and spoke, her voice soft but insistent. "The locket is convincing, yes. It is easy to believe, and yet in its ease lies deception. We must not be content with this early resolution, for the true criminal has deliberately guided our attention here and remains at liberty, observing the very chaos they created." A silence settled over the room. The officers, uneasy now, exchanged glances, realizing that Miss Marple's quiet certainty carried more weight than their own misplaced triumph. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, as if echoing her warning. Appearances could deceive, and victory, when rushed, could be a trap. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the study, the chess pawn, the ledger, and the faint traces of powder. The game had begun, but the decisive moves were yet to come. Whoever had orchestrated this crime understood the power of perception, the danger of assumption, and the advantage of subtlety, and she, ever patient, would wait, observe, and allow the game to unfold until the truth revealed itself. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the evening in quiet reflection, seated near the study window where the fading sunlight cast long, angular shadows across the polished floors. The day's events, the locket, the hurried assumption of Arthur's guilt, the misplaced confidence of the constables, had left her unsettled. The real criminal remained unseen, a master of subtlety and misdirection, and she knew that to uncover them, she would need to look beyond the immediate details into the history of Ashford Manor and its occupants. Her mind returned to the faint scuff marks on the hearth, the powder on the inkwell, and the chess pawn. Each seemed minor in isolation, yet together they suggested a familiarity with both the house and the psychology of its inhabitants. Someone had moved through this investigation with a careful, almost intimate knowledge of behaviour and expectation. It was not just the mechanics of the crime that mattered, but the orchestration of perception. Miss Marple realised that to understand motive fully, she would need to uncover a connection that went far deeper than contemporary quarrels or opportunistic desire. Her thoughts drifted to a case she had investigated many years earlier, one she had long considered resolved but never entirely forgotten. It involved a similar web of familial tension, a minor heirloom misused, and a young relative whose ambitions were carefully manipulated by someone unseen. Though decades had passed, she sensed echoes of the same dynamics at Ashford Manor. A forgotten debt, an old grievance, or a past slight could easily have seeded the motives now manifesting as jealousy, fear, and ambition. She resolved to explore this line of thought, quietly retracing events and connections that others might overlook. Miss Marple began with Havisham, the butler, whose long tenure in the household had given him not only access but knowledge. She questioned him about previous disputes, minor conflicts, and past tensions within the family. "Mr. Havisham," she asked gently, "has there ever been a disagreement or incident involving Sir Cedric, Lady Ashford, or Mr. Pembroke that might explain old resentments or long-standing tensions?" Havisham hesitated, hands tightening behind his back. "There was an incident many years ago," he admitted finally. "Sir Cedric's younger brother, now deceased, was involved in some minor financial disputes with the family. Arthur's father had some connection to those disagreements. Nothing serious, or at least nothing that anyone thought relevant. It was all settled quietly, long before Mr. Pembroke arrived here." Miss Marple's mind raced. Financial disputes, quietly settled, but left a residual strain. Small grievances often festered in the background, influencing actions and decisions in ways invisible to casual observation. "And the family was aware of this?" she asked. "Somewhat," Havisham replied, "but they considered it closed. Arthur, of course, was a child at the time. I never imagined it would have any bearing on what has happened now." Miss Marple made a mental note. Childhood grievances and the subtle shaping of ambitions could easily have created fertile ground for resentment or manipulation. The pieces of motive, carefully observed, were beginning to align with patterns she had seen before. Old debts, perceived slights, and ambitions quietly nurtured over time. Turning her attention to Lady Ashford, she probed delicately. "Lady Ashford, are you aware of any historical tensions between your late husband and other members of the family? Perhaps disputes long resolved, or misunderstandings now resurfacing?" The lady's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes clouding with memories. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly. "There were disagreements years ago. Between Sir Cedric and his late brother, yes, and between the families. Small grievances, they said, but they left their mark. It was never spoken of openly, and we tried to move past it. But sometimes old wounds do not heal completely." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, small grievances versus wounds that do not heal. The tension between the official narrative and the emotional reality was subtle but significant. Something dormant had been reawakened, a connection long buried but now emerging with consequences. She then revisited Collins, the gardener. His attention had been drawn to shadows and movements on the night of the murder, but Miss Marple suspected he held more knowledge than he realised. "Mr. Collins," she asked, "has there been any history between the families you have observed over the years? Minor disputes, old favours, or secret resentments?" The gardener scratched his head, a habit of thought. "Well, the Ashfords have always been protective of the estate. I've heard talk of old disagreements, rivalries among cousins, inheritance squabbles. Nothing official, just murmurs. But people tend to remember the old stories, and sometimes they influence what they do today." Miss Marple's sense of the larger picture strengthened. The murder was not simply a response to immediate opportunity or overt ambition. It was entwined with the past, with grudges, perceptions, and carefully nurtured tensions that had lain dormant until catalyzed by present circumstances. A pattern emerged. Those involved were connected by shared history, some conscious of it, others influenced by it unknowingly. She pulled together the various threads, the locket, the chess pawn, the powder on the desk, the shadows observed by Collins, the subtle hesitations in testimony, and now the revealed echoes of past grievances. The narrative was becoming multidimensional. Each suspect's motive was compounded by historical context, creating a network of interrelated pressures, ambitions, and fears. No one acted in isolation. The past had shaped their perceptions, influencing actions and reactions in ways subtle enough to evade conventional investigation. Miss Marple recalled the cryptic note in the conservatory. "The first move decides all. Watch the pawn, for the path is never as it seems." With the past now in mind, the metaphor of the pawn gained clarity. The pawn was not merely a game piece. It symbolized history, minor actors whose small actions could determine outcomes far beyond their apparent importance. The murderer had orchestrated a sequence that relied on historical knowledge, guiding perceptions and manipulating assumptions with precision. Her eyes returned to the chessboard on the mantel, an unused set but positioned as though inviting attention. The moves of the past, the carefully measured steps of old grievances, the interplay of familial connections, all conspired to form a hidden architecture of influence. Miss Marple understood that the true criminal had used history as a tool, exploiting the interconnectedness of household members to engineer a facade of simplicity while remaining obscured behind layers of perception and legacy. As the evening deepened into night, Miss Marple felt the first clear outlines of understanding. The crime was not simply about inheritance or opportunity. It was about the persistent shadow of past events, long-forgotten disputes now reawakened. The suspects were linked not only by the events of that night, but by a lattice of history, grievances, and subtle psychological nudges that had guided their behavior. She sat back in the quiet of the study, eyes sweeping the room, tracing the invisible connections that spanned decades. The powder, the pawn, the locket, all were elements in a carefully choreographed game, designed to misdirect and distract, yet leaving faint, almost imperceptible traces for a patient observer to follow. The real crime, she realized, was a dialogue between past and present, a manipulation of perception rooted in history and executed with deliberate care. Outside, the wind rustled the trees of Ashford Manor, carrying the whispers of time and memory. Miss Marple's mind traced the hidden connections between household members, each influenced by the past in ways they did not fully understand. The truth was no longer simply a matter of present observation. It required a comprehension of history, an appreciation for human memory, and the patience to interpret subtle cues left by both intention and habit. By the time the household retired for the night, Miss Marple had mapped the interplay of past and present in her mind. She understood the contours of influence, the latent motives resurfacing through opportunity, and the delicate balance of perception and deception at play. The shadows of the past had emerged, casting long and deliberate shapes over the crime, and she knew that recognizing these connections would be key to revealing the true criminal. Miss Marple had spent hours reviewing every scrap of evidence, every whispered account, and every subtle gesture she had observed. By now, the household had grown restless under the weight of inquiry and the false sense of closure offered by the locket. The constables had retreated into procedural routine, convinced of Arthur Pembroke's guilt, while Miss Marple felt the real solution lurking just out of reach. It was time to employ an unconventional approach, one that would probe human behavior rather than relying solely on physical evidence. She began by arranging the study much as it had appeared on the night of the murder, taking care to place objects precisely where they had been. The ledger open, the chess pawn resting on the blotter, the silver inkwell slightly tipped as though recently used. She then invited the household to the room under the pretense of reviewing the timeline of events, a harmless, procedural gathering in the eyes of the constables. Her method was subtle. She did not confront anyone directly, nor did she accuse. Instead, she observed, posed small questions, and introduced tiny, controlled variables into the environment, designed to elicit responses. First, she asked casually, "Mr. Pembroke, have you noticed anything out of place in the study that might seem unimportant at first glance?" Arthur hesitated, scanning the room as though to reassure himself that everything was in order. He glanced at the pawn, then the ledger, then at Miss Marple herself. "Nothing in particular," he said, his voice steady but slightly tighter than usual. Miss Marple nodded and moved to Havisham. "And you, Mr. Havisham, have you observed anything amiss in your duties that night or any other evening?" The butler's lips pressed into a firm line. "No, Miss Marple, everything was as it should be." His posture, rigid and controlled, betrayed only a hint of impatience. Then she addressed Lady Ashford. "Lady Ashford, the locket found under the carpet has caused quite a stir. In your recollection, does it seem familiar?" The widow's eyes widened fractionally, and her fingers tightened around her shawl. "No, I don't believe I have seen it before." She hesitated, as though questioning the truth of her own words. Miss Marple's tactic was simple yet effective. She observed micro-expressions, the subtle discrepancies between words and body language. To an outsider, her questioning seemed innocuous, almost conversational. Yet within those tiny reactions, she could see the hidden currents of intent and deception. Next, she introduced a controlled anomaly, a minor fabricated inconsistency in the narrative of the evening. She casually mentioned that a servant had reported seeing a second key on the study desk that night, one that did not belong to anyone present. She watched the reactions closely, noting not just verbal replies but the imperceptible shifts in posture, blink rate, and hand movement. Lady Ashford blinked more rapidly, glancing toward Havisham before returning her gaze to Miss Marple. "A second key?" she said softly. I cannot imagine what that would be." Havisham's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "There was no second key, not to my knowledge." Arthur's eyes flickered toward the door, then back. I didn't see anything of the sort," he said quickly. His voice carried a slight strain, a fissure Miss Marple immediately recognized. Finally, Miss Marple addressed Collins. "And you, Mr. Collins, have you ever noticed any unusual keys, objects, or letters around the house that might have been overlooked?" The gardener's expression was neutral, but his gaze lingered on the ledger, then the chess pawn. He shook his head. "Nothing I can recall. I only keep to my rounds." Having introduced the anomaly, Miss Marple allowed silence to settle over the room. In quiet, small cracks often became visible. She noted that Arthur's reaction had been the most pronounced. Not fear for the crime, but a subtle agitation that suggested awareness. He had not lied outright, but the tension in his voice and his gaze betrayed knowledge he wished to conceal. She pressed gently. "Sometimes the smallest detail can change everything. If someone had used a spare key that night, how might that alter our understanding of events?" The room held its breath. Arthur's hands flexed against his knees, his knuckles white. I suppose it could make things more complicated," he admitted, carefully measured words revealing far more than their surface meaning. Miss Marple made a mental note. This small, unconventional test, the introduction of a fabricated anomaly, had produced a reaction revealing concealed awareness. Arthur had demonstrated a crack in his otherwise composed exterior, a subtle sign that he knew more than he had admitted. The response was not guilt in the direct sense, but a reflection of his perception of the manipulation of events. Miss Marple's mind traced the implications. If Arthur was aware of the placement of a key that did not exist, or even if he suspected such a thing, then someone had engineered a scenario to manipulate the household's assumptions. That someone possessed not only the knowledge of objects and access, but a deep understanding of how people perceived reality. Arthur's reaction confirmed that he was attuned to these manipulations, whether or not he was the perpetrator himself. She decided to extend the method further, introducing another subtle test. She moved the chess pawn slightly out of alignment, resting it askew on the blotter as though it had been disturbed. Then, without comment, she observed the room once more. Lady Ashford's eyes flicked toward the pawn, a faint tension in her shoulders. Havisham's hands itched at his sides as though to adjust it, restrained by a sense of propriety. Collins's gaze lingered briefly and moved on. Arthur's eyes narrowed fractionally, his lips pressing together as if considering the significance of the displacement. a tiny reaction, imperceptible to anyone else, yet Miss Marple recognized it immediately. He was alert to minute changes, aware of the significance of the pawn as a signal, and sensitive to the manipulation of perception. By evening, Miss Marple had gathered more than just observations. She had begun to map the psychological landscape of the household. The unconventional tactic, introducing small, controlled anomalies, revealed more than physical evidence ever could. It exposed knowledge, awareness, and susceptibility to manipulation, highlighting subtle cracks in the facades each suspect maintained. As she sat by the window once more, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The real criminal was not yet revealed, but the terrain had shifted. The tests had identified those attuned to the orchestration of perception and those blind to its manipulation. In the subtle interplay of reactions, she saw the outlines of strategy, intention, and awareness. The chessboard, the pawn, the locket, and now the reactions to anomalies all formed a constellation of clues. The investigation had moved beyond tangible objects to the realm of human perception, subtle cues, and psychological insight. Whoever had orchestrated Sir Cedric's death had done so with a keen understanding of expectation, perception, and misdirection. Miss Marple, armed with her unconventional approach, was now positioned to trace these threads with precision, one subtle reaction at a time. The room fell into a contemplative hush, the shadows lengthening across the floor. Miss Marple's eyes swept the study, cataloguing every nuance, every minor expression, every flicker of awareness. The unconventional tactic had revealed more than she had anticipated. It had exposed the first cracks in the carefully constructed veil of deception. Somewhere within these subtle reactions lay the key to understanding not only who had committed the crime, but how the intricate web of motive history and opportunity had been woven. Miss Marple knew that patience and careful observation would guide her to the final revelation. The game had shifted, and the players, though unaware, had revealed more than they intended. Miss Marple had allowed the household to settle into a quiet routine that afternoon, giving them the illusion of normalcy while she meticulously reviewed the evidence she had gathered. The chess pawn, the ledger, the faint traces of powder, all these fragments had begun to form a coherent pattern, one that hinted at both motive and method. She had observed the subtle cracks in Arthur's composure, Havisham's restrained rigidity, and Lady Ashford's careful vigilance. For a brief moment, she felt the investigation moving steadily forward, as if the murky veil that had clouded the manor was finally lifting. Yet as she reached for the ledger to cross-reference some notes, a sharp shock ran through her. The ledger was gone. She froze, carefully scanning the room. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The chess pawn remained in its slightly askew position, the inkwell still faintly dusted with powder. But the ledger, the key to tracing the financial undertones and subtle notations that could reveal motive, had vanished. Her heart did not race, nor did panic cloud her mind. Miss Marple's years of experience had taught her that evidence rarely disappeared without reason, and rarely without purpose. Someone was deliberately obstructing the investigation, aiming to bury the truth before it could be unearthed. The disappearance was calculated, subtle, and designed to unsettle. Whoever had taken the ledger was aware of its significance, aware of her methods, and aware that she was close to seeing the pattern emerge. Miss Marple glanced toward the household members, noting their reactions. Lady Ashford's eyes widened imperceptibly, her hands tightening around the edge of the chair. Havisham's posture stiffened, a subtle tension in his jaw. Arthur Pembroke's gaze darted toward the mantel, then away, betraying the faintest flicker of unease. Collins, the gardener, leaned slightly forward as if trying to catch a shadow of movement outside the window. "Has anyone seen the ledger?" she asked calmly, her voice betraying none of her internal calculation. I haven't touched it," Arthur said, voice careful, controlled, but edged with uncertainty. Havisham's lips pressed together. "Nor I. It was in its place earlier, Miss Marple." Lady Ashford shook her head slowly. "I did not go near it." Collins remained silent, his eyes fixed on a corner of the room. Miss Marple considered the timing. The ledger had been present just hours earlier, and yet now it was gone, leaving a void in both the physical and psychological landscape of the investigation. Whoever had removed it had done so without leaving overt traces. No broken lock, no displaced items, no fingerprints that the constables could immediately identify. The theft was precise, deliberate, and indicative of someone intimately familiar with the manor and the ongoing inquiry. She decided to investigate the likely paths the ledger could have taken. The study had only a few points of ingress: the door leading to the main corridor, the window, and the small side cabinet, which had always been locked and remained so. She ruled out casual movement. This was no simple act of carelessness or opportunism. The evidence had been taken by someone who knew the ledger's value and the importance of its contents to her investigation. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Havisham. The butler had access to every corner of the house, every key and every routine. He was capable of moving undetected and had the composure to conceal the act from others, yet she did not accuse outright. Observation was her tool, not confrontation. Instead, she allowed the possibility of misdirection, recalling how the locket had earlier drawn the constable's attention away from the subtle clues. Perhaps the ledger had been removed to produce the same effect: a false sense of frustration, a diversion, a manipulation of perception. She then turned her attention to Lady Ashford, noting her delicate agitation. Could her concern be genuine, or was it a carefully performed display meant to divert suspicion? The widow's social acumen made her capable of both sincere emotion and strategic deception, and Miss Marple knew the value of watching without speaking, of letting reactions unfold naturally under subtle pressure. Arthur Pembroke's brief hesitation had already marked him as sensitive to manipulation, and the disappearance of the ledger seemed to exacerbate that tension. Miss Marple considered that he might be aware of who had removed it, or perhaps even complicit, either knowingly or inadvertently, in the concealment. His prior reactions to minor anomalies had revealed cracks in his composure. Now the missing ledger threatened to widen those fissures. Miss Marple's gaze then shifted toward Collins, who had remained mostly silent. The gardener's position allowed him a unique perspective on household activity. He could move unseen, observe unnoticed, and act without immediate detection. His quiet attention had often yielded insights in the past, but now that very awareness made him a potential agent of obstruction, either willingly or as a conduit for another's intentions. Rather than confront anyone directly, Miss Marple decided on a different approach. She began retracing the ledger's last known location, observing the subtle marks on the floor, the displacement of dust, the faint impressions on the rug, and the alignment of furniture. The ledger had been removed carefully, deliberately avoiding disturbance, yet the act had left traces for an observer attuned to detail. Miss Marple followed the faint patterns of movement, her mind charting invisible paths, predicting where the item might be hidden or who might have taken it. The disappearance also intensified the psychological dimensions of the case. Trust, already fragile, became even more tenuous. No one could be fully certain of what others knew or concealed. The constant vigilance required to maintain composure in the face of observation created subtle cracks in every facade. Miss Marple realized that these cracks, once identified, could reveal as much as any physical evidence. As night fell over Ashford Manor, she quietly questioned herself about motive. Who would gain from the ledger's disappearance? It was not just a simple act of theft, it was a strategic move designed to delay, confuse, and mislead. Whoever had orchestrated it understood the human tendency to assume closure and distraction, exploiting the eagerness of the authorities and the emotional instability of the household. Miss Marple also reflected on the timing. The ledger vanished just as the investigation was gathering momentum after the unconventional tests she had employed to reveal cracks in awareness. This was no accident. The theft was a counter-move, a tactical response aimed at protecting the real criminal while the case appeared to advance. It was a statement. The game was ongoing, and the rules were dictated by someone in command of both strategy and patience. She studied the household one by one. Lady Ashford's controlled grief, Havisham's disciplined composure, Arthur's subtle anxiety, and Collins's quiet observance all contained fragments of the larger picture. The ledger's absence illuminated not just the physical act of removal, but the mental dynamics at play, the interplay of control, fear, anticipation, and deceit. Each reaction revealed the contours of knowledge and awareness, and in these Miss Marple saw the outlines of the perpetrator's skill. Even as the wind rustled through the trees outside, rattling the windows, Miss Marple remained calm. The vanishing evidence had not derailed the investigation, it had sharpened it, exposing vulnerabilities and tendencies that had been previously hidden. She allowed the constables to fume over the missing ledger, letting their frustration occupy them, while she quietly reconstructed the threads of information, realigning her observations with the new variables introduced by this act of obstruction. By the time the household retired for the night, Miss Marple had mapped the implications. Whoever had removed the ledger was not merely trying to hide a book. They were manipulating perception, controlling timing, and exploiting human tendencies. The stakes had risen. The web of deception had deepened. Trust was fragile, but Miss Marple's patience and insight gave her the advantage. The perpetrator had acted boldly, but even in boldness they left traces only a careful observer could discern. Miss Marple settled into her chair, eyes tracing the shadows of the study, noting every subtle detail that might have gone unnoticed. The case had gained new momentum, not through clarity, but through the deliberate obfuscation of the criminal. And she understood, with the certainty that came from decades of careful observation, that this act of vanishing evidence was both a challenge and an invitation. The real criminal was still at large, and the game was far from over. The next morning brought a tense stillness to Ashford Manor, a fragile quiet that seemed almost deliberate, as though the house itself had grown wary of human presence. Miss Marple had spent the early hours retracing the paths of movement from the night before, reviewing every subtle clue, every reaction she had noted during her unconventional tests, and mentally mapping the shadowy outlines of motive and opportunity. Yet even as she catalogued these observations, a deep unease had settled over her. The vanishing ledger was more than an obstruction, it was a declaration. The real perpetrator was still at large, actively shaping the course of the investigation, and every hour that passed increased the danger lurking within the manor. By mid-morning, the fragile peace shattered. Collins, the gardener, appeared at the top of the grand staircase, breathless, his eyes wide with alarm. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple!" he called, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "It's Sir Cedric's study. There's been something terrible." Miss Marple rose immediately, her mind sharpening. She followed Collins through the corridor, noting how he fumbled with the door latch, as if the simple act of entering the study had become almost unbearable. When she pushed the door open, a chill ran down her spine. Lady Ashford stood near the fireplace, frozen, her face pale, one hand pressed to her mouth, and there, sprawled across the rug, lay Arthur Pembroke, or rather, the lifeless figure of someone who had been so central to the investigation moments before. It was not Arthur. It was Havisham, the butler. His body lay awkwardly on the rug, the small silver inkwell from the desk overturned beside him, its contents smeared across the polished floor. The pattern suggested a struggle, perhaps sudden and desperate, though there were no signs of forced entry. A single, precise wound to the temple had ended his life swiftly. The room carried the faint scent of lavender soap and dust, a seemingly innocent mixture now imbued with menace. Miss Marple's heart, calm though racing internally, noted immediately what this new crime implied. The perpetrator had escalated, proving both their audacity and their control. Havisham had been someone of caution, disciplined and careful. To be struck down so suddenly suggested a message, a warning to all who dared pursue the truth. She observed the scene with meticulous attention. The ledger was still, missing, naturally, and the chess pawn lay undisturbed near the blotter, its significance now taking on a darker resonance. The powder from the inkwell suggested either an attempt to destroy evidence or a deliberate act to create confusion. Whoever had killed Havisham was calculating, understanding that every detail could mislead or inform depending on the observer's acuity. Lady Ashford's reaction drew Miss Marple's attention next. The widow's fingers trembled slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had not screamed, she had not fainted. Her composed exterior suggested a remarkable self-control, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of tension around her eyes, a sign that the unfolding events were moving too close to something she wished to conceal. Arthur Pembroke, meanwhile, appeared from the corridor, having been summoned by Collins's urgent cries. His expression, initially one of shock, quickly hardened as he saw the scene before him. "Havisham," he whispered, almost to himself. There was a subtle shift in his demeanour, an awareness that the true danger had been underestimated, and that the game being played was far more intricate than he had imagined. Miss Marple understood immediately that the second death altered the stakes entirely. The perpetrator was not merely attempting to conceal the initial murder. They were actively manipulating the investigation, removing those whose insight or reliability might threaten exposure. Havisham had been cautious, observant, and capable. He had posed a threat to the criminal's carefully constructed facade. His sudden removal proved that the murderer was several steps ahead, fully anticipating the moves of those who sought to uncover the truth. The detective moved quietly around the room, noting details others might dismiss. The placement of Havisham's body suggested that he had been killed swiftly, yet there was a faint smudge of dust on the windowsill, a clue that someone had entered or exited with precision, leaving only the subtlest trace. The inkwell's overturned contents formed no discernible pattern, but Miss Marple considered it might have been used to obscure another, more telling sign. She turned to Arthur. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Anything at all that seemed out of place?" she asked calmly, her eyes watching for any subtle response. Arthur hesitated. I thought I saw a shadow near the conservatory, moving toward the study, but I dismissed it. I didn't think anyone could be capable." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Ah, but sometimes shadows are more than they appear, Mr. Pembroke. They may conceal movement, intention, or even anticipation of our own steps." Arthur's eyes narrowed, realizing the implication. He understood that his earlier observations, dismissed as trivial, now might have provided critical insight. Yet they had been rendered useless by Havisham's death. The criminal had removed a witness, someone capable of interpreting subtle cues, someone whose experience might have challenged the misdirection carefully set in place. Miss Marple considered the implications for the household. Lady Ashford, naturally fearful, was likely weighing her own position, measuring her responses to ensure survival. Collins, previously silent, now hovered near the doorway, eyes alert, observing both the detective and the reactions of the others. Each of them was implicated not just by association, but by the potential knowledge they held or might inadvertently reveal. Trust had grown increasingly fragile. The murderer had transformed the manor into a psychological battlefield. Miss Marple decided that immediate caution was required. She instructed Arthur to remain in the room, subtly positioning him where he could observe without interfering. She asked Lady Ashford to sit quietly, offering tea as a distraction while keeping her under gentle surveillance. Collins was asked to monitor the perimeter of the house without leaving the premises, ensuring that no further intrusion could occur unseen. As she surveyed the room once more, Miss Marple's attention returned to the chess pawn, now seemingly innocuous against the grim tableau. Its presence, constant through both murders, suggested deliberate symbolism. The first move, the initial distraction, and perhaps a signal left by the criminal to indicate control, intention, or challenge. The pawn was no longer merely a clue, it was a statement. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect. The second murder had not only intensified the danger, but had clarified the criminal's capacity for foresight. They were not a reckless opportunist, but a strategist, someone who understood human behavior, timing, and perception. The investigation could no longer rely solely on observation or deduction of motive. Now it required anticipation, vigilance, and protective measures to prevent further acts of violence. She moved to the window, noting the angle of light, the shadows cast by the surrounding trees, and the faint impressions in the dust on the sill. Whoever had committed this second act had done so with precision, anticipating the house's routines and the reactions of its occupants. Miss Marple understood that the true challenge had begun, to uncover the criminal not merely through evidence but by outthinking them, predicting their next move before it could be executed. As the evening darkened, Miss Marple set her plan in motion. She would observe, record, and subtly manipulate the environment, using human perception itself as a tool to expose deception. The second murder had transformed the investigation into a race against time. The criminal was agile, cunning, and audacious, but Miss Marple knew that patience, careful observation, and insight into human behavior would provide the advantage she needed. The game had taken a sharp, dangerous turn, and now she faced not only solving a crime but preventing another. Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, the lingering chill of the morning's events clinging to the corners of the room. The death of Havisham had shaken the household more profoundly than she allowed herself to show, yet her mind worked steadily, tracing the contours of behavior, movement, and minute details that others dismissed. She had long believed that the mind, careful observation, and patient reflection could reveal what brute force and assumption could not. Now, in the wake of a second violent act, she needed all of these faculties more than ever. She began by revisiting the series of anomalies and observations that had accumulated over the past several days. The locket found beneath the carpet, the chess pawn askew on the blotter, the ledger that had vanished, Havisham's body, Arthur's subtle reactions, Lady Ashford's carefully controlled responses, all of it formed a disjointed array of fragments. Yet Miss Marple trusted that, like pieces of a puzzle, they would reveal a coherent picture once she recognized the underlying logic guiding them. Her eyes returned to the pawn. She had long suspected it carried symbolic meaning, but its persistence through both incidents suggested something more deliberate. Perhaps the pawn was not merely a distraction, nor simply a signal. It might indicate a sequence, a careful orchestration of movements in both space and time. Miss Marple reflected on the cryptic note she had found weeks before. The first move decides all. Watch the pawn, for the path is never as it seems. Her attention then shifted to a seemingly trivial observation from the previous evening. Arthur had brushed against the piano in the sitting room as he entered, his fingers lingering on the keys for a moment longer than necessary. At the time, Miss Marple had noted the action but dismissed it as nervous habit. Now, in the context of the escalating crimes, that gesture gained significance. It suggested familiarity with the house, a subtle comfort in moving through rooms and interacting with objects as though anticipating events, or perhaps manipulating them. She recalled Collins's quiet attentiveness during her unconventional tests. The gardener had observed, noted, and moved only when required, rarely betraying emotion. He had been reliable, yet unobtrusive, a figure whose neutrality had allowed him to see what others could not. Miss Marple considered whether Collins' movements around the grounds might have intersected with the moments of intrusion, whether his knowledge of routines had been exploited, or even, inadvertently, provided opportunity to another. Then, a comment made by Lady Ashford the evening before returned to her memory. In conversation, she had remarked, almost as an aside, "One never knows which old grievances will resurface when one least expects it." At the time, the remark had seemed philosophical, a reflection on familial tension and history. But in light of recent events, Miss Marple realized it contained both insight and inadvertent truth. The crimes were not only about opportunity, they were entwined with historical knowledge and long-buried grudges. The perpetrator had used the past as both shield and weapon, exploiting awareness of relationships and historical tensions to misdirect attention. Miss Marple then turned to the ledger, or rather, its absence. The disappearance had seemed like a deliberate obstruction, a manipulative act meant to delay the investigation. Yet she now suspected that the ledger's removal, while obstructive, was not the crux of the plan. Its absence had provided the criminal with cover, but the true strategy had been built around perception itself, the way people interpreted evidence, reacted to suggestion, and unconsciously revealed their knowledge. As she catalogued these observations, a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern began to emerge. Each act, each movement, each response from the household seemed designed not only to conceal the murderer's identity, but to draw attention to irrelevant details, to encourage assumptions, and to manipulate timing. The pawn, the locket, the subtle reactions, they were all pieces of a performance, guiding observers along a carefully calculated path. The criminal had relied upon their knowledge of human behavior, anticipating that even careful observers would be tempted to see what was obvious, rather than what was hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's eyes then fell upon a small, otherwise insignificant object, a silver letter opener lying on the desk, its handle polished to a dull gleam. She had noticed it before, but dismissed it as a mundane instrument, part of the everyday life of the study. Now, she realized its placement was deliberate. Its proximity to the chessboard and the blotter, the alignment with the powder smears, and the slight indentation on the desk's surface suggested that it had been used, not only in the removal of Havisham's ledger, perhaps, but also as a signal, a positional marker, a subtle guide for the criminal's movements. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. The key to the case had not been hidden in complex cryptograms, inaccessible documents, or obscure forensic anomalies. It had been in the interaction between human behavior and the seemingly mundane objects in the environment. The criminal had manipulated perception, relying on the observer's expectations and assumptions to conceal intention, and the pattern, once recognized, revealed the orchestrator's foresight, knowledge, and audacity. Miss Marple considered the psychological architecture of the crimes. The initial murder had been calculated to mislead, the disappearance of the ledger to delay discovery, and the second murder to escalate tension and remove a potential threat. Each act intersected with history, opportunity, and human expectation. The subtle cues, the pawn, the letter opener, Arthur's nervous habits, Lady Ashford's philosophical remark were not isolated. They were interconnected, forming a lattice of intention. The criminal had relied upon this lattice, weaving perception and reality into a coherent but deceptive whole. Her eyes returned to Arthur. The young man's sensitivity to minor anomalies, his awareness of misdirection, and his reactions to subtle manipulations suggested he had noticed elements of the orchestration, but had not yet understood the entire pattern. Miss Marple recognized that he could be both a witness and an unintentional participant, moved by the criminal's choreography without full comprehension of the underlying design. Lady Ashford, too, revealed herself in retrospect to have been both aware and constrained. Her remarks, gestures, and careful composure indicated understanding of historical tensions, awareness of manipulation, and the capacity for strategic concealment. Collins's observant neutrality had allowed him to witness more than most, while Havisham's discipline and precision had made him a threat to the criminal, necessitating his removal. By late afternoon, the full pattern had emerged in Miss Marple's mind. The criminal's strategy was not simply to kill or conceal. It was to manipulate observation, control perception, and anticipate reaction. The key had been in plain sight all along: the subtle orchestration of human behavior, the placement of objects, the deliberate introduction of distractions, and the exploitation of history and expectation. The crimes were as much about psychological engineering as physical action. With this understanding, Miss Marple felt a renewed clarity. The threads of motive, opportunity, and method, which had seemed fragmented and chaotic, now interwove into a coherent design. Each detail that had seemed trivial, the offhand remark, the small object, the unusual habit, now resonated with significance. The criminal had relied upon subtlety, assuming that these small elements would be overlooked, and yet they formed the very framework through which the truth could be revealed. Miss Marple looked across the room, her gaze resting on the chessboard once more. The pawn, small and unassuming, was no longer merely a symbol but a keystone in the pattern she had discerned. The moves of the past and present, the orchestration of perception, and the interactions of the household had all aligned to reveal the underlying logic. The criminal's audacity had been matched by precision, but Miss Marple's patience, insight, and careful observation had brought the hidden design into focus. She knew that the next step required careful execution. Recognizing the pattern was one thing. Confronting the criminal and preventing further violence would require strategy, foresight, and subtlety. Yet for the first time since the initial murder, the case felt less like a maze and more like a path, illuminated by insight, observation, and the quiet certainty that the smallest details often carried the greatest significance. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. The chaos had clarified, the confusion had resolved into coherence, and the invisible threads that had governed the criminal's actions were now visible to her careful, patient mind. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the path to uncovering the truth and bringing the perpetrator to light. Miss Marple had spent the night in quiet reflection, tracing the lattice of subtle clues and human reactions that had slowly revealed the criminal's orchestration. The pattern had emerged, illuminating the calculated nature of the crimes and the psychological manipulation that underpinned them. Yet, despite the clarity of method and observation, she felt the core of the motive had yet to reveal itself. There was a hidden layer, a reason beyond mere greed or anger, a driving force that had pushed the perpetrator to orchestrate murder and deceit with such meticulous precision. She returned to the study the next morning, surveying the room as if it were a map of the mind itself. The chess pawn lay in its usual place, understated yet charged with meaning. The silver letter opener caught the light, glinting faintly as though hinting at secrets untold. Miss Marple traced each object with her eyes, recalling the reactions and gestures of those who had interacted with them, and gradually a realization began to form, a motive far more intricate and chilling than she had anticipated. The first clue came from a remark Arthur Pembroke had made days earlier, now reframed in light of the broader pattern. "One must sometimes act to protect what cannot be spoken of," he had said quietly, almost under his breath, when commenting on the ledger's disappearance. At the time, it had seemed a vague musing on propriety, perhaps even a hint of guilt. But in context, Miss Marple recognized it as the echo of a deeper concern: secrecy, legacy, and the fear of exposure. She then considered Lady Ashford, whose composure had often masked subtle tension. Her remarks about old grievances and the resurfacing of past conflicts were not mere philosophy. They were acknowledgement of buried truths. A family history of secrets, misdeeds, and unspoken shame provided fertile ground for manipulation. Miss Marple began to understand that the crimes were not primarily about material gain or social leverage. They were about control, the preservation of hidden truths, and the exertion of influence over those who might uncover them. Colin's quiet attentiveness, Arthur's sensitivity to anomalies, and Havisham's precision all now seemed to converge around one central figure, someone who had perceived the danger posed by observation and acted preemptively to shape the narrative. Miss Marple realized that the motive had less to do with the immediate events of the present and more with the fear of historical revelation. The perpetrator had killed not merely to conceal a crime, but to maintain dominance over knowledge itself, to ensure that secrets carefully cultivated and jealously guarded remained beyond scrutiny. The ledger's disappearance, previously understood as an obstruction, now took on new significance. It contained more than financial records or mundane correspondence. It preserved fragments of memory, evidence of past misdeeds, and subtle indications of long-forgotten rivalries. Whoever had removed it understood its value not in currency, but in truth, the potential exposure of personal failings, hidden motives, and uncomfortable realities. The theft was preemptive, a way to ensure that information could not be leveraged against the criminal, and that the narrative remained under their control. Miss Marple recalled the subtle psychological cues she had noted throughout the investigation, the shifts in posture, the fleeting micro-expressions, the seemingly innocuous comments that hinted at deeper awareness. Each of these had pointed to a mind attuned not only to manipulation, but to the preservation of self-image, legacy, and control over perception. The villain's psychology was revealed in these tiny, deliberate gestures: a preoccupation with appearances, a need to orchestrate events, and a willingness to go to lethal extremes to maintain authority. The second murder, Havisham's, now made sense within this framework. Havisham had been disciplined, reliable, and observant, qualities that posed a threat to someone seeking to control the narrative. His removal was strategic, not impulsive, an act designed to eliminate a source of insight that could unravel carefully constructed deceptions. The act was precise, calculated, and imbued with a cold logic that prioritized preservation of secrecy over moral constraint. Miss Marple also considered Arthur's reactions. He had been sensitive to minor anomalies, aware of subtleties that might reveal manipulation, yet he had not fully grasped the underlying motive. His responses had inadvertently revealed cracks in the criminal's facade, showing awareness of orchestration without comprehension of its ultimate purpose. In this, He had both aided and complicated the investigation, offering glimpses of truth that required careful interpretation to align with the broader pattern. Lady Ashford, too, emerged as central to the psychological landscape. Her controlled composure, philosophical remarks, and subtle gestures were indicative of someone deeply invested in preserving appearances and legacy. Miss Marple realized that the motive was entwined with family history, social position, and personal pride, a complex interplay of fear, dominance, and the desire to remain unexamined. The criminal had acted not merely to remove obstacles, but to assert authority over knowledge, perception, and the fragile equilibrium of social expectation. A subtle detail then crystallized the entire motive. Miss Marple recalled the positioning of the chessboard, the alignment of the pawn, and the deliberate placement of objects. Each move was symbolic, reflecting both strategic thought and psychological intent. The pawn, small and seemingly innocuous, represented the expendable, the manipulated, and the easily influenced. Those who had been removed or unsettled were the pawns in the criminal's game, tools to shape perception and maintain control over outcomes. The realization struck Miss Marple fully. The crimes were not committed for wealth, revenge, or jealousy in isolation. They were enacted to preserve secrecy, manipulate perception, and control the narrative of history itself. The villain's psychology was revealed in the orchestration, in the precise timing, and in the awareness of human behavior. The willingness to kill, to remove witnesses, and to manipulate events demonstrated a chilling calculation, an absence of moral restraint, tempered only by the desire for domination and protection of carefully guarded truths. Miss Marple's mind traced the implications. The criminal was not acting in a vacuum, but in a web of relationships, historical knowledge, and perceived threats. Every act of violence, concealment, and misdirection was designed to reinforce authority over knowledge and maintain control over perception. The pattern of behavior revealed a mind capable of strategic thinking, foresight, and manipulation at a level that had initially seemed almost impossible. By midday, Miss Marple had reconstructed the full motive. The villain had acted to preserve secrets, protect personal and familial reputation, and exert dominance over those capable of discovering the truth. The psychological drive was a combination of fear, pride, and a desire for control, an intricate, almost pathological compulsion to shape the world according to their own design. The crimes were a reflection of this inner logic, a logical extension of a deeply rooted need to manipulate perception and safeguard hidden truths. She now understood the final piece of the puzzle. The murder, the vanishing ledger, the calculated removal of Havisham, and the subtle manipulations of perception all converged into a single coherent motive: control over knowledge, fear of exposure, and the assertion of authority over both history and the human actors entwined in it. The revelation was as shocking as it was inevitable, exposing not merely the surface acts of crime, but the intricate architecture of the criminal's mind. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the weight of insight settling over her. The hidden motive had been revealed. Not greed, not revenge, not passion, but a deeper, more chilling psychology, one that demanded meticulous orchestration, subtle manipulation, and lethal enforcement. Understanding this, she knew, would not only clarify the past crimes, but provide the key to anticipating the criminal's next move, preventing further tragedy, and ultimately exposing the one who had so carefully engineered the chaos at Ashford Manor. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in careful preparation. The revelation of the hidden motive had crystallized her understanding of the criminal's psychology, and she knew that the final confrontation required both patience and precision. Every move, every object, every reaction would be crucial. She needed to craft a scenario that would reveal the perpetrator through their own instincts, without forcing them into defensive postures that might obscure the truth. She arranged the study much as it had been during the initial investigation, placing the chessboard in the same position, the pawn slightly askew, and the silver letter opener lying precisely where it had been when she discerned its significance. She ensured the room appeared undisturbed, the ledger's absence again serving as a quiet invitation for the criminal to reveal themselves. Every detail was deliberate, designed to trigger recognition, reaction, and ultimately, confession. Arthur Pembroke and Lady Ashford were asked to remain in adjoining rooms, their presence necessary for both observation and controlled safety. Collins was instructed to maintain his quiet vigilance near the back entrance, ensuring that no opportunity for escape or external interference could occur. Miss Marple herself remained in the study, seated with an air of calm contemplation, her eyes constantly scanning for the slightest disturbance, the faintest tremor of behaviour, or a misstep in composure. As evening fell, the manor settled into the familiar tension of anticipation. Shadows lengthened and the wind whispered through the eaves, carrying with it an almost theatrical sense of foreboding. Miss Marple's nerves were steady, the trap had been set, and the pieces were all in place. She knew that the criminal's compulsion to control, to manipulate, and to assert dominance over perception would guide them into predictable behaviours. It was only a matter of waiting for the right moment. A faint sound from the corridor drew her attention, a step, careful, deliberate, almost imperceptible. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, noting the figure that emerged from the shadow. Lady Ashford herself moving toward the study under the guise of curiosity. Miss Marple allowed her entry, observing the subtle hesitation in her movements, the careful control of her expression. It was clear that the widow believed she was asserting agency, but her actions betrayed anxiety, calculation, and a lingering awareness of the crimes that had unfolded. As Lady Ashford approached the desk, her eyes flicked to the chessboard, the pawn, and the letter opener. Miss Marple's steady voice broke the silence. "It is curious, isn't it, how the smallest details can hold the greatest weight," she said, her tone conversational, yet layered with subtle authority. "A pawn may appear insignificant, yet it can influence the course of a game entirely. Would you not agree?" Lady Ashford paused, her fingers hovering over the desk. The flicker of recognition passed across her features, a subtle, involuntary response, betraying a deep understanding of the implication. She attempted composure, yet her eyes betrayed both anxiety and calculation. I suppose that depends on the game, Miss Marple," she replied cautiously, voice measured yet tense. Miss Marple inclined her head, observing every micro-expression. "Indeed, and sometimes the players themselves do not realize how much influence they wield, or how much danger surrounds their moves. One's actions may ripple far beyond the initial intention." Lady Ashford's lips pressed together. She shifted slightly, inadvertently aligning herself with the angle from which Miss Marple had predicted observation would trigger recognition. The detective's subtle arrangement of objects, gestures, and words was working as intended. She watched Lady Ashford's fingers brush over the ledger's usual position, the small tremor of hesitation, the imperceptible flush in her cheeks. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "sometimes one must act decisively to protect what cannot be spoken of, even if the method is extreme." Her eyes met Lady Ashford's directly. The widow's composure wavered, a flash of understanding and fear mingling in her gaze. Lady Ashford's breath quickened. You know," she whispered, voice trembling. "You know everything. The ledger, the pawn, Havisham, the rest. You know why I had to act." Miss Marple remained calm, her tone gentle, yet unwavering. "I understand the fear of exposure, the need to maintain control over history and perception, and I understand the steps you took to preserve secrecy." She allowed a pause, letting the weight of observation and recognition settle. "But I also understand that the consequences of such actions extend beyond control. They leave traces, reflections, and, ultimately, understanding for those who observe carefully." Lady Ashford's hands trembled visibly now. She glanced toward the door, perhaps considering flight, but the calculated positioning of Collins and Arthur ensured that any attempt would be thwarted. Her eyes returned to Miss Marple, conflicted, aware that resistance was futile. The psychological architecture of the trap, combined with the anticipation of human instinct, had cornered her, not with force, but with inevitability. I had to," Lady Ashford confessed, her voice breaking. "Havisham, he was too perceptive. The ledger, if it had been found, everything would have been revealed. The secrets, the histories, the disgrace. I could not allow it. And Sir Cedric, I did what was necessary to protect the legacy, the reputation, the family name. I had no choice." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, her gaze unwavering. "Choice is always present, my dear, and understanding the consequences of action is part of the human condition. What has been done cannot be undone, but recognition of motive and the revelation of truth can still prevent further tragedy." Lady Ashford slumped slightly, the weight of confession pressing upon her. The carefully controlled facade, maintained with years of practice and subtle psychological mastery, finally gave way. She had acted with meticulous calculation, yet the very strategies designed to conceal her intentions had exposed them to a mind equally patient, observant, and insightful. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room, letting the confession breathe and the acknowledgment of motive take root. Then, with quiet authority, she instructed Collins to secure Lady Ashford until the authorities arrived. Arthur, still shaken, remained as witness, observing the culmination of events that had threatened to spiral out of control. The detective took a deep breath, surveying the study one final time. The chessboard, the pawn, the letter opener, all objects that had seemed innocuous now, served as markers of insight, keys to understanding the criminal's psychology and motive. The orchestration, the subtle manipulations, and the calculated removal of evidence had all been carefully anticipated, yet the trap Miss Marple had set had drawn the perpetrator into the light without a single overt threat. As the distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the manor, signalling the arrival of the constables, Miss Marple allowed herself the briefest smile. The game was complete, the pattern resolved, and the hidden motive laid bare. Justice, patient yet inevitable, would now follow, guided by observation, insight, and the unerring understanding of human nature. Miss Marple had allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Lady Ashford's confession, coupled with the meticulously constructed trap, seemed to bring the long and perilous investigation to a close. The study, now restored to order after the confrontation, felt almost peaceful. The chessboard was returned to its neutral position, the silver letter opener safely laid aside, and the air seemed lighter, as if the resolution of the crime itself had lifted a tangible weight from the manor. Yet Miss Marple, ever attentive to the subtleties of human behaviour, could not dismiss the faint, persistent unease that lingered like a shadow at the edges of her perception. As she moved through the corridors, reviewing each room with careful scrutiny, a small detail caught her attention, a minor anomaly that she had noticed before but had not fully explored. In the hall outside the study, a set of footprints in the dust was partially erased, the pattern uneven and hesitant, as though someone had tried to mask their passage. What puzzled her was the subtle direction. The prints led from the conservatory toward the library, a path that had seemingly been undisturbed during the prior investigation. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's practiced eye recognized the telltale signature of calculated movement. She followed the trail quietly, noting the impression of fine shoes on the polished floor, and paused at the doorway to the library. Something felt off. The room was untouched, yet the air carried a faint hint of perfume, distinct, unfamiliar, and slightly cloying. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, recalling every person in the household and the minute details of their comportment. This scent did not belong to Lady Ashford, nor to Arthur, Collins, or even the late Havisham. It was new, an intrusion. Her attention then shifted to the library desk. A ledger lay in its usual place, but one corner was slightly bent, as though it had been handled with care and yet with haste. Miss Marple gently lifted it, noting that the handwriting in a particular section differed from all previous entries. The script was careful, precise, but unmistakably deliberate, an imitation that sought to mirror the known entries while concealing its true origin. A sudden realization struck her. Lady Ashford's confession, though genuine in its narrative of motive and action, had not accounted for every manipulation in the chain of events. Certain subtleties, the positioning of objects, the orchestration of perception, the timing of disturbances, suggested the involvement of a second hand. The true mastermind, it seemed, had remained hidden in plain sight, orchestrating alongside Lady Ashford, ensuring that even her confession would not capture the full scope of the deception. Miss Marple considered who in the household possessed both the opportunity and the psychological acuity to execute such parallel manipulation. Arthur Pembroke, she knew, had been reactive rather than proactive. Collins, while observant, lacked the motive to orchestrate murder and deceit at this level. That left an unexpected candidate, someone whose seeming passivity masked acute intelligence, patience, and a capacity for subtle influence. The librarian, Mrs. Winthrop, who had remained in the shadows of the investigation, quietly cataloguing books and monitoring the household's comings and goings, now appeared in a new light. Mrs. Winthrop had always been polite, almost invisible, a figure whose role was to maintain order and observe quietly. Miss Marple recalled how the librarian's eyes had subtly shifted during questioning, how small gestures, touching a bookmark, adjusting a ledger, moving slightly out of alignment with the light, had seemed insignificant at the time, but these were now revealed as signs of deliberate attention, careful control of narrative, and a capacity to anticipate both action and reaction. Returning to the study, Miss Marple orchestrated a subtle test. She requested that Arthur place the chess pieces in the same positions as the day of Lady Ashford's confession. As he did so, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Winthrop, whose presence in the room had been quietly maintained under the guise of assisting with cataloguing. Her gaze flickered toward the pawn, then the letter opener, and finally toward the empty corner, where the ledger had been removed. The movements were minute, almost imperceptible, but they betrayed recognition, anticipation, and subtle calculation, a controlled, measured awareness that aligned perfectly with the hallmarks of the hidden mastermind. Miss Marple's mind connected the threads. Lady Ashford's confession had been genuine in motivation, but incomplete in execution. Mrs. Winthrop had ensured the orchestration of the pattern, the subtle misdirection, and the timing of each action, guiding both perception and reaction to ensure the desired outcome. She had engineered the seemingly perfect trap, managing not only the logistics of concealment, but also the psychological pressure that had elicited Lady Ashford's confession. The true genius of manipulation had remained unchallenged, hidden behind a veneer of politeness and unobtrusiveness. The detective approached Mrs. Winthrop gently, speaking in her measured, calm tone. "You have been quite observant, haven't you, Mrs. Winthrop? So careful, so precise, so patient." The librarian's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a book on the shelf. Her composure strained beneath the quiet authority in Miss Marple's voice. I only wish to see justice done," Mrs. Winthrop replied, her voice low, almost defensive, yet betraying a flicker of recognition that her deception had been seen. "Lady Ashford, she could not, she had to act, but I ensured that the sequence would not falter. It was necessary." Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Necessary, perhaps, in your view? But manipulation, even with the intention of guiding the outcome, has consequences. Havisham, the ledger, the subtle orchestration of perception, all of it points to a mind not merely assisting, but directing, and that direction has left a trail, visible to those who observe carefully. Mrs. Winthrop's composure collapsed. Her hands fell to her sides, and she sank into a chair, the mask of quiet control giving way to raw, exposed vulnerability. The perfect twist, the revelation of the true mastermind, had been exposed not through confrontation alone, but through a combination of observation, understanding of psychology, and anticipation of human reaction. Miss Marple had anticipated the final move in a game that had seemed complete only hours before. Arthur and Lady Ashford, observing from the doorway, could scarcely believe the revelation. The librarian, who had seemed peripheral, had in fact been central, guiding events with subtlety that had eluded every other observer. Miss Marple explained, gently but firmly, the reasoning behind the unmasking, connecting the psychological cues, the deliberate movements, and the orchestrated sequence of events to the careful manipulation that had been ongoing all along. By the time the constables arrived to secure Mrs. Winthrop, the manor felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because the depth of manipulation had been more intricate than anyone had imagined. Lighter because the true sequence of events, with its complex psychological underpinnings, had been revealed. Miss Marple's patience, attention to detail, and understanding of human behaviour had allowed her to uncover the final twist, completing the intricate tapestry of truth that had been carefully obscured at every stage. As she surveyed the room one last time, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest triumphant smile. The case had seemed resolved, yet her persistence and insight had illuminated the final, hidden truth. Justice, once again, had been guided not by force alone, but by observation, understanding, and the unerring perception of human nature at its most intricate and deceptive. The morning after Mrs. Winthrop's revelation was quiet, almost deceptively so, as the manor settled into an uneasy calm. The air seemed heavier, charged with the knowledge of what had been uncovered, yet tinged with the sense that not all resolutions could erase the echoes of deceit. Miss Marple walked through the halls, her steps measured, her mind tracing the sequence of events one final time, ensuring that no detail had escaped her careful scrutiny. Lady Ashford had been taken into custody, her confession forming the cornerstone of the initial resolution. She had admitted her role in Havisham's death, the removal of the ledger, and the orchestration of subtle psychological pressures to manipulate those around her. To the untrained eye, the case appeared closed. Justice, it seemed, had been served. Yet Miss Marple's keen sense of observation had revealed a complexity that went beyond a single confession. The true mastermind, Mrs. Winthrop, had been overlooked until the final twist, demonstrating that appearances, even confessions, could be deceptive. The librarian had been quietly escorted to a separate room, the constables maintaining a respectful but firm presence. Miss Marple observed her, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the small tremors of hands, and the lingering glimmer of defiance in the eyes. Mrs. Winthrop had acted with calculated patience, ensuring that every misdirection, every subtle cue, and every orchestrated event fell neatly into place. It was a demonstration of intellect and psychological acumen that few could rival, and Miss Marple could not help but admire the precision, even as she acknowledged its danger. Drawing Arthur aside, Miss Marple began to explain what had been missed in the initial investigation. "You see, my dear," she said gently, "every detail that seemed insignificant, the pawn left slightly askew, the placement of the letter opener, even the way Lady Ashford's eyes moved, was part of a larger design. The orchestration relied not on brute force or obvious threats, but on subtle manipulation of perception. Those who are not trained to notice such things will see only what they expect, not what is actually happening." Arthur listened intently, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. "So, it wasn't just Lady Ashford. She was only part of it." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "She acted out of fear, a desire to protect secrets and preserve legacy. But she was guided, directed, even assisted in ways that she could not fully control. The true architect, the one who orchestrated perception, timed actions, and ensured misdirection, was Mrs. Winthrop. The traces of her influence were subtle, a careful glance, a micro-adjustment of objects, an almost imperceptible scent that suggested presence or absence. It is these small threads that, when connected, reveal the full tapestry." Miss Marple moved through the study, retracing the key points of manipulation. "Observe the chessboard," she said, gesturing to the neutral setup. The pawn was a signal, a marker, a psychological trigger. It suggested importance to the observers, while signalling sequences to those who understood the pattern. The ledger, removed and partially altered, contained information that could have unravelled the narrative if it fell into unintended hands. Each action, each object, was a deliberate cue. Arthur nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the subtle brilliance of the orchestration. And Mrs. Winthrop, she was just so quiet, so unnoticed. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her tone soft but incisive. "Invisibility is the greatest tool of manipulation. Those who presume that silence equals passivity often overlook the most influential actors. Her patience, her attention to detail, and her understanding of human behavior allowed her to control outcomes without direct confrontation. It is a rare form of intellect, one that is both fascinating and dangerous." As the afternoon progressed, the constables prepared to escort Mrs. Winthrop for formal questioning and eventual trial. Yet even as they led her away, Miss Marple could not dismiss a lingering unease. Mrs. Winthrop's intelligence, resourcefulness, and subtle cunning meant that the resolution, though legally sufficient, might not fully extinguish the influence she had exerted over the household. She could observe, anticipate, and adapt, traits that made her capable of manipulating future events in ways not immediately apparent. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, allowed herself a private reflection. Justice had been delivered in the sense that the immediate crimes had been exposed, the perpetrators identified, and the guilty parties accounted for. Yet the psychological impact, the awareness of manipulation, the exposure of hidden motives, the subtle orchestration of events, left behind an unsettling residue. The manner, the witnesses, and even those formerly involved in the investigation would carry the echoes of Mrs. Winthrop's influence long after the legal processes concluded. She turned her attention once more to the small, seemingly trivial details that had been so central to the unravelling of the case: the pawn, the ledger, the letter opener, and the precise positioning of objects. Each had been a test, a signal, and a psychological tool. It is often the things we overlook, the minor gestures and quiet manipulations, that carry the greatest weight, she mused, addressing Arthur, who had been observing in growing comprehension. We see what we expect to see, yet the truth resides in what is unnoticed, in the gaps between action and perception. That is why observation, patience, and understanding of human nature are indispensable in uncovering deception. Arthur absorbed the lesson with growing respect, realizing that the case had been as much about intellect and insight as it had been about motive and evidence. Miss Marple's genius lay not in the brute collection of facts, but in her ability to perceive the connections, anticipate behaviour, and reconstruct events from the smallest cues. She had remained one step ahead at every stage, predicting moves, understanding hidden drives, and revealing truths that others would have missed entirely. As the evening deepened and the manor settled into a subdued quiet, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The case, though formally concluded, had left its mark. The revelation of the hidden mastermind, the exposure of intricate psychological manipulation, and the understanding of the subtle interplay between human behaviour and criminal design. Justice had been served in the immediate sense, yet the lingering awareness of what had transpired created a sense of unfinished business, a reminder that intellect and cunning could extend far beyond the reach of law. In the end, Miss Marple walked through the study one last time, her eyes tracing the objects and arrangements that had been so central to the investigation. She allowed herself a faint, knowing smile, confident that the hidden patterns, the orchestrated cues, and the subtle manipulations had all been observed and understood. Justice had been delivered, but the lesson remained clear. The world is full of subtleties, and it is only through careful observation, insight, and understanding of human nature that truth can truly be revealed. The village was quiet again, the storm of revelation having passed. Inspector Harrington stood outside the inn, the pale light of dawn washing across the cobblestones, a chill mist rising from the earth as though the world itself wished to erase the night's horrors. The townsfolk, restless and suspicious only hours before, now huddled in whispered groups, clinging to the comfort of a resolution. The villain had been revealed, the motives laid bare, and justice in some form had been served. Yet Harrington's face betrayed no satisfaction. His sharp eyes lingered on the smallest things, the uneven scrape on the window frame, the faint smell of smoke lingering in the alley, the way one villager's gaze seemed fixed not on relief but on fear. He lit a cigarette, though the morning air was still damp, and let the smoke curl around him. The case was concluded, or so it seemed. The papers would write their stories, the constables would file their reports, and the village would begin, slowly, to stitch itself back together. But Harrington knew better. Mysteries never truly ended. They simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to return. As he walked through the square, his boots echoing against stone, he replayed every step of the investigation in his mind. The lies told, the masks worn, the tangled motives that had led to bloodshed, all of it formed a story that appeared whole. Yet in the background, like a note slightly out of tune in an orchestra, there remained something that refused to resolve. A single inconsistency. It was the letter, he realized. the one that had been discovered in the widow's drawer, scrawled in hurried ink and half burned at the edges. Its words had pointed suspicion in a certain direction, its timing had been critical, and yet no one had ever confirmed who had delivered it. The villagers had accepted it as evidence, and in the tide of events it had seemed to fit. But Harrington could not shake the certainty that the letter had been a hand guiding the story from the shadows, nudging everyone toward the conclusion they were meant to reach. He stopped near the edge of the woods, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. In the distance a crow called, harsh and mocking. The detective's cigarette burned low between his fingers as he considered what the letter implied. If someone else had been moving pieces behind the scenes, then the case, for all its drama, was only the surface of a deeper game. A mastermind, perhaps, still unseen, watching the village and its little tragedies with quiet amusement. The thought both unsettled and exhilarated him. He had chased shadows all his life, solved puzzles others could not even see, and yet here was a possibility that the greatest mystery remained untouched, just out of reach. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. That was the nature of the world. Closure was an illusion, certainty a comfort for those unwilling to peer into the abyss. Behind him, a villager's voice called out, thanking him, praising him for bringing peace. Harrington nodded without turning, offering only the vaguest acknowledgement. Peace was not his business. Truth was, and the truth had a way of stretching far beyond the borders of any one crime. He flicked the last of his cigarette into the wet grass and walked on, his coat collar turned up against the breeze. To the villagers, he was leaving a finished tale behind. To himself, he was stepping into another, one already beginning to whisper in the spaces between what had been said and what had been left unsaid. And as the road stretched before him, winding into fog and uncertainty, Harrington thought of the letter again. A hand unseen, a voice unheard, a presence that had not yet revealed itself. Yes, there would be another case. There always was. Mysteries did not die. They only changed their shape. The detective smiled into the mist. The story was far from over.